the unnatural, the hyper-arbitrary, and so on, in other words, what artists and intellectuals are supposed to make, was to force all of this to conform to the existing said, the already said, instead of a further experimentation with the processes of naming and interpretation. In other words, anti-intellectualism is something like a resistance to experimentation. For Deleuze, criticism was even opposed to judgment. Judgment is ruled by the creditor-debtor relationship, so that judgment is always forced to connect to some debt, some form, some particular end, and then we become, quote, no longer debtors of the gods, but become in our entire being the infinite debtor of a single God, close quote. Again, he affirmed criticism as combat, a will to power, not a will to domination, quote, to bring into existence and not to judge, close quote. In other words, our standard scholarly academic work rests on judgments. It does not rest on bringing into existence concepts which are unmanageable, potentially uncontrollable, intellectually stimulating, socially even useless, but nonetheless interesting and in new ways achieve new combinations or amalgamations. So, to summarize, from Pierre Bourdieu to Corinne McCherry to Marilyn Strathern, a terrific little book called Audit Cultures, to Sam Weber, writing brilliantly on Kierkegaard, to Foucault, and on and on and on. There is a lot of discourse on this topic, and it hangs on, quite often, intangible effects. In a recent book published by Harvard, the sociologist Michel Lamont said tenure, everyone's familiar with that word, right? Tenure is too local to be evaluated by any kind of national criteria. It's a local event. But the reception of grants guarantees the good products of the universities. It's a little, did you get that? We can't evaluate tenure, but if you get a grant, you must be doing good work. It's a little boggling how many problems there are with her method of analysis and refusals to investigate, to analyze, as well as Harvard lending itself to this. But it is not surprising that the reception of funds becomes the sole guarantee of intellectual quality. If you didn't get a grant, your work must be unintellectual. Getting the money is then our equivalent of a judgment of God. and again, since I refuse cynicism all the way through, not sarcasm, but cynicism, one could argue that we have, in fact, as a society, as we become more allegedly diverse and plural and multicultural and so on, we've also become more classically bourgeois than ever. It all goes on in the same train, if that's the instrument. A former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine has cogently argued that with pharmacological study, quote, it is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research published or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines, close quote. This distinguished editor asks why the law comes so slow to modulate basic research. Stanley Fish, in his typical ironic, cynical manner, asks how academic professional judgment can withstand the legal scrutiny of universities. Lawyers stay out, or stay in the law schools. But he must already know that the American university has been created over many years of legal wrangling to shelter higher education as such, including issues of privacy and the refusal of universities to make their practices open to scrutiny. Faculty governance is so weak at so many institutions that to even claim professors are protected by the law is potentially misleading. Again, this is a big pot with many elements in it, and I'm not trying to make a judgment myself on this, other than to point out that anti-intellectualism is intrinsic now to any system that has as many basic functions and operations that are inherently contradictory. as the university is. Again, the idea that contemporary art and intellectual life is free from anti-intellectualism has been one of our dominant mythologies. Let me give a short, pithy, I hope, case study. No city and its institutions prides itself more than Los Angeles as a vector of the new, the true, the real, the authentic, the necessary, the relevant, all of those mega concepts by which art and culture is often embedded in. Progressives are firmly in control of the major institutions, including the schools in Los Angeles. It seems remarkable that Eli Grove has been able to take control of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art, and is now having built his own personal museum in downtown Los Angeles, which will house his 2,000-piece art collection. In other words, one person, three institutions, 40 years after criticism landed in Los Angeles in the form of a kind of neo-Marxism, a critical progressive feminism, but the institutions have gone the other way. They have retreated as these critical political movements became more and more part of the agenda. 2 years ago, MoCA received a loan of $30 million from Grove, giving him control of the institution and its board, which includes even countercultural artists such as Catherine Opie. In December 2010, a couple months ago, the new director, Jeffrey Dietz, came out of the New York gallery system, had commissioned and then painted over, or had a mural painted over. It was put up by the Italian artist Blue. The story was picked up by the local downtown newspaper, and then when the LA Times finally turned to it, using their senior art critic Christopher Knight, it was argued that, quote, and this is, bear with me, this is a long but important quote. Last week, MoCA raised eyebrows, immediately lighting up the blogosphere, when the Italian street artist Blue painted an immense mural on the north wall of the Geffen Contemporary in Little Tokyo, and within hours the museum had the mural whitewashed. As the facts emerged, so did the fatal error. I want to come back to that phrase. Note he calls this a fatal error. MoCA had no clear idea what the artist would paint before he painted it. This is the pun. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it's said. Once MoCA's director, Deach, who was in Miami for an art fair, returned home and saw Blue's handiwork, he said no. Deach explained that he made the decision to remove the mural very quickly, unprompted, fatal error, unprompted by complaints, presumably from outside or inside the museum. Deach's explanation for the decision is entirely reasonable. Again, this is the only public discussion on, you can call it whitewashing, but I would call it censorship. He told the Times that the mural, 3 stories high, the length of a football field, was insensitive to the local community. But notice, there were no complaints from the local community. Depicting row upon row of coffins draped in dollar bills, it was adjacent to a war memorial. Deach, quote, "This is 100% about my effort to be a good, responsible, respectful neighbor in this historic community," close quote. In June, he started work as the first art dealer to become director of a major American museum, close quote. Now, Knight couldn't go farther than to say that this was, quote, "a self-inflicted wound," close quote. Yet in the months since then, he's devoted a lot of space to the Smithsonian censorship of a gay artist. The position here is local and collective. Not one LA-based artist has said anything about this. It's LA, filled with progressive, the home of In emails with a colleague at Cal Arts and in the art school, he referred, an important local artist, he referred to the MoCA censorship this way. Quote, "One thing about Deitch's move. It is correct that most respectable artists look down on street artists, and very few would mobilize to criticize Deitch." Close quote. Blue is, quote, "Blue is actually interesting as an animator. See his films on YouTube, in which his drawings crawl and slither around Buenos Aires." Close quote. Quote, "One funny thing about the whole deal is that Blue is Italian, and the Japanese-American troops commemorated next to MoCA, stupidly imagined and then defended by Deitch, actually fought in the Battle of Monte Cassino." Close quote. The only perspective the artist here can take, and who has written extensively about censorship and related matters in the United States, is to put this into an ironic context. He invokes the hierarchy of academic art to account for the lack of interest in censorship. He lauds the artist's work in another medium. He notes the irony of the work, but not one word again on the process that actually generated this specific incident or event. Tom Lawson, the dean of the art school at Cal Arts, took up the issue in the journal he edits, East of Borneo, noting the mural had been whitewashed, and the main reason was, quote, "the fading significance," close quote, of the LA Times. Quote, "Locals know that the mural never had much of a chance to be seen." I'm really curious how that was known to the locals. Not just because the museum moved quickly to cover it over, but because it was painted on the back of the Geffen building facing a low-cost parking lot. Close quote. How much or the frequency of its being visible, being seen, has nothing to do, of course, with it being taken down, unless the author here is saying that MoCA made a violent business decision, which raises the very interesting conjunction. Is it okay to be anti-intellectual if you're making a business decision? Is this what from business passes into intellectual life or into cultural, critical life? Our dean gets to his point. Quote, "The biggest problem was likely an ambivalence about the meaning of the museum's invitation to Blue in the first place." Close quote. He then summarizes, quote, "Street artists are guerrilla activists with no concern for property rights. They take what they can, where they can, to make their statement and accept whitewash and bulldozers as part of the landscape." Close quote. Now, Blue is not a street artist. He is a graffiti artist. They're not the same thing. And to say that, what he's basically saying is that the artist should have expected the work to be taken down because it's part of it. He puts the focus on the object